Back away from the console, now. I don't think so. You have no idea who you're dealing with. No. You have no idea who you're dealing with. The Verath-7 Transit Hub occupied a converted deep space relay station at the outer edge of the Kalindra corridor, positioned precisely because no single governing body wanted to claim responsibility for it, and every governing body needed it to function. It processed approximately 4,000 transients per standard cycle. Refugees, traders, diplomats traveling under false credentials, and the occasional species whose political status was technically under review by 3 separate interstellar bodies simultaneously. It was the kind of place that survived by being useful to everyone and threatening to no one. It had maintained that balance for 9 years. The balance ended on a Tuesday, which was, in the Kalindra corridor's loosely observed standard timekeeping, the least dramatic day of the cycle. No major cargo transfers were scheduled. The diplomatic attaché from the Verath consortium had already departed. The hub's senior administrator had taken a personal rotation and left her deputy in charge, which meant the duty roster was running on skeleton staff, and the secondary docking bays were operating at minimum observation. Into this gap arrived a Sulhari trade vessel registered under civilian documentation that described its manifest as agricultural equipment components and its passenger list as 7 commercial representatives traveling to a distribution conference on the far side of the corridor. The Sulhari Commercial Authority did not have a military designation. It operated under trade law, not fleet law, which meant its vessels triggered a different tier of arrival protocols, the kind that involved less scrutiny and more paperwork filed after the fact. The 7 commercial representatives were not commercial representatives. They were operatives from the Sulhari Enforcement Compact, a body whose formal mandate described it as an internal regulatory division, but whose practical function had, over the preceding 2 years, expanded considerably beyond anything the word regulatory was intended to cover. Their current project was the recovery of a Sulhari data architect named Verath, who had, according to their documentation, departed Sulhari space in possession of proprietary infrastructure schematics that constituted a security matter under compact jurisdiction. Verath was currently seated at a terminal in the hub's civilian transit lounge, waiting for a connecting departure that was 4 hours away. He was 31 years old, thin in the way that people become thin when they have been moving without stopping for 6 weeks. And he was carrying a bag that contained 3 changes of clothing, a personal data module, and documentation that the hub's intake processing system had flagged as legitimate under 2 separate authentication protocols. What the Sulhari Enforcement Compact found when their 7 operatives moved through the transit lounge was a man named Declan Reeves sitting at the adjacent terminal, eating something that the hub's food synthesizer had produced under the category of soup with only marginal accuracy, and reading what appeared to be maintenance logs on a secondary tablet. Declan Reeves was 34 years old. He was the hub's facilities coordination officer, a position that had been created 3 administrative cycles ago when the hub's directorate had determined that the volume of maintenance requests, docking logistics, structural assessments, and interagency compliance filings had exceeded what any single existing role could absorb. The position required someone who understood both technical systems and procedural documentation, who could navigate the bureaucratic frameworks of 4 different governing bodies simultaneously, and who was comfortable operating in a space where the rules were, at best, an ongoing negotiation. The Sulhari operative who approached Verath, a compact, precise woman named Seth Varos, who had spent 11 years with the Enforcement Compact and who had conducted 14 extractions across 6 separate jurisdictions without a significant complication, registered Declan Reeves in her peripheral assessment and filed him under the category of irrelevant. He was wearing the hub's standard gray facilities uniform. He had the specific posture of someone engaged in low-priority administrative work. His tablet contained maintenance logs. Her assessment was not a factor. Seth Varos had conducted 14 extractions. Her assessment process had never been wrong in a way that mattered. She placed her hand on Verath's shoulder. Declan looked up from his soup. "This individual is being detained under Sulhari Compact jurisdiction," Seth Varos said, with the specific tone of a person who has said this sentence enough times that it has stopped being a sentence and become a procedure. "This is a routine matter. Civilian personnel are requested to clear the immediate area." Declan put down his soup. "That's going to be a problem," he said. The tone was not aggressive. It was not alarmed. It carried the specific quality of a person who has been handed a scheduling conflict and is calculating the fastest path to resolution. calm, focused, and oriented entirely toward the practical. Seth Varos looked at him for the first time as something other than peripheral. "Civilian," she said. "I strongly recommend." "He's under Transit Hub intake protection," Declan said. "Filed under the Calindra Corridor Non-Interference Compact, Article 7, Subsection 4. Which your documentation when you registered your arrival, if your documentation had listed your actual organizational affiliation." He paused. "It didn't." "A beat. Which is a separate problem," he said, "but relevant to the current one." The 6 other Sulhari operatives had moved into positions around the lounge. Declan registered all 6 without appearing to look at any of them, with the specific awareness of a person for whom knowing where everyone in a room is located has been a professional habit for long enough that it no longer requires conscious attention. The hub's transit lounge had 1 primary exit, 2 service corridors, and a maintenance access panel behind the eastern bank of terminals that connected directly to the hub's secondary operations deck. Declan knew the panel was there because he had filed the maintenance report on its pressure seal 3 weeks ago, and had personally assessed the interior access corridor when the seal replacement was scheduled. Seth Varos's hand remained on Orenveth's shoulder. "You have," she said, "approximately 30 seconds to reconsider your position." "I'm not in a position," Declan said. "I'm doing my job." What happened next was documented by the hub security recording system across 7 simultaneous feed angles, and the subsequent review by the Calindra Corridor Joint Security Council would spend 2 full sessions on the footage before submitting a report that described the sequence as demonstrating situational awareness and threat response inconsistent with the standard profile of a facilities coordination officer. What the report meant was that Declan moved in ways that the Sulhari Enforcement Compact had not planned for, because their plan had been built on the assumption that a facilities coordination officer was a facilities coordination officer. He was not, technically, only a facilities coordination officer. The first 3 operatives between Declan and Seth Varos encountered a specific and effective series of outcomes before Seth Varos had completed processing the fact that Declan was no longer seated. The operative who had positioned himself at the service corridor entrance discovered that the angle he had chosen was, from a tactical standpoint, the angle Declan needed him to be at. The operative nearest the eastern terminal bank found himself at the maintenance access panel in a manner and orientation that he had not chosen. Seth Varos released Orenveth's shoulder, not because she decided to, because the applied mechanics of a wrist control technique that Declan had drilled approximately 8,000 times, first in a gymnasium in Petawawa, Ontario, and subsequently in field conditions across 2 continents and 1 orbital platform before he had ever heard of the Calindra Corridor, made the release the only available outcome. She found herself facing a man who was standing between her and Orenveth with the same calm expression he had been wearing over his soup 4 minutes earlier. The expression of a person who has completed a task and filed it under resolved and is now waiting to see if there are additional line items. The remaining operatives stopped moving. Orenveth had not moved from his terminal. He was looking at Declan with the expression of a person who has been running for 6 weeks and has genuinely not allowed himself to believe that stopping was a possibility. "You're going to want to sit down," Declan said to him. "This is going to take a few minutes to document." Then to Seth Varos, "Your vessel is going to be held at the secondary dock pending a compliance review. You're welcome to file a counter-complaint through the Sulhari Commercial Authority's registered liaison with this hub, which will take approximately 6 to 8 standard cycles to process." A pause. "In the meantime, this individual remains under Transit Hub protection." The hub's alert system had triggered at the 40-second mark. Corridor security personnel arrived at the 3-minute threshold and found 6 Sulhari operatives in various states of secured incapacitation. 1 Sulhari senior operative standing with a specific quality of stillness that indicated she was re-evaluating a significant number of assumptions, 1 transit passenger sitting exactly where he had been when this started, and 1 facilities coordination officer completing preliminary incident documentation on his secondary tablet. The joint security report filed within the hour described the incident as a procedurally irregular response to an unauthorized extraction attempt. The Sulhari Enforcement Compact filed its own internal assessment, later obtained through standard intelligence channels, which described the hub's facilities coordination officer as presenting an operationally anomalous threat profile. The Sulhari Compact's formal language for an entity that had not fit any of the categories they had brought with them. They did not attempt another extraction from Verath-7. Declan found Veth in the hub's small observation gallery 2 hours later, after the documentation had been filed, and the Sulhari vessel had been formally held, and the Joint Security Council had been notified through the appropriate channels. Oren was sitting at the far end of the gallery, looking at the star field through the reinforced viewing panel, with the specific quality of someone who is not really looking at anything, who is simply doing the thing that keeps them from having to interact with the reality of the last 2 hours. Declan sat down next to him with 2 cups of what the hub's food synthesizer produced under the category of coffee, a description that required significant goodwill on the part of the drinker. He put one in front of Oren. Oren looked at the cup, then at Declan. "Facilities coordination," he said. "It wasn't quite a question. It says that on my identification badge," Declan said. "That's not what you are." Declan considered the cup in front of him. Outside the viewing panel, the Kalindra corridor's transit lanes were lit by the running lights of a dozen vessels, in various stages of approach or departure, small moving points against the dark. He had been looking at similar views from similar windows for 3 years. They were, he had found, a reasonable thing to look at when you were thinking about how to answer a question accurately. Coordinate facilities, he said. Docking assignments, structural maintenance, interagency compliance and filings. A pause. I'm also the person they put in this position because the position needed someone who could handle situations that weren't in the facilities coordination manual. Oren was quiet for a moment. Where were you before this? Joint Task Force 2, Declan said, and before that Regular Force 8 years, Royal Canadian Regiment, and before that a town in northern Ontario that doesn't have much vision, very good fishing, and a hockey rink that's been in use since 1987. Oren absorbed this. JTF2, he said. Yes, that's, he stopped. Started again. That's not a facilities coordination background. No, Declan said. It isn't. He did not say. The reason there is a facilities coordination officer at Verath-7, who spent 8 years in the Royal Canadian Regiment and 4 years with the most operationally demanding counter-terrorism unit in the Canadian Armed Forces, is that someone at the Hub Directorate made a decision that this posting needed a specific kind of person, and that kind of person needed a job title that would not attract attention. He did not say this because Veth was intelligent enough to have already arrived at that conclusion. Oren looked at the star field for a moment. The schematics, he said. That's what they want. I know. They're not. It's not what they're saying it is. The documentation they filed, the proprietary security matter. He stopped its infrastructure for the civilian communication networks in the outer Sulhari territories. If the compact controls the architecture of those networks, then they control what moves through them, Declan said. Yes. Is that on the data module you're carrying? Oren looked at him. It's my job to know what's on the intake manifests of individuals flagged under Article 7 protections, Declan said. You filed a sealed data declaration at intake. I didn't open it. I'm not going to open it. But I know it exists. A pause. I can make sure it exists in the right places before you board your connecting departure. Redundant filing, Coalition Data Archive. 3 separate corridor authority registries. The kind of redundancy that means the data isn't controlled by any single party and can't be made to disappear by any single party. He picked up his cup. It's not a guarantee of anything. It doesn't fix the political situation, but it changes the value calculation for the compact. Material that's already distributed is less worth pursuing than material that's still in one place. Oren was quiet for a long time. Outside, a bulk freighter was making its approach to the primary docking ring, its running lights blinking in the slow, patient rhythm of a vessel that had been in transit for a long time and was not in a hurry now that the destination was visible. Why? Oren said finally. Declan looked at him. Said you were carrying proprietary security material and needed to be returned to Sulhari jurisdiction. 14 extraction operations, that's the number in Seth Varos's record. He set down his cup. Every one of them returned someone to a jurisdiction that had decided they needed to be returned. I checked what I could in the time I had. He was quiet for a moment. None of the people she returned were doing well afterward. Oren absorbed this. It was the kind of information that a person receives differently depending on whether they already knew it or suspected it or had been trying not to know it for 6 weeks while they were moving without stopping. The data module, he said. Give it to me when you're ready. I'll handle the filing. You don't have to. It's, Declan said with a specific and mild tone, my job. Oren's connecting departure was scheduled for departure in 2 hours. Declan spent the time between the observation gallery and the docking bay finishing his incident report, filing the compliance documentation on the Sulhari vessel, and completing the redundant data archive filings that were, technically, within his procedural mandate as the hub's interagency compliance officer, even if they were not, technically, something that facilities coordination officers typically did. He had become, over 3 years at Verath-7, very good at finding things that were technically within his procedural mandate. The hub's deputy administrator, a meticulous Verath named Sulhari, who had been in her role for 7 years and had developed a precise instinct for the specific kind of situation that fell outside standard administrative frameworks, found him at his workstation an hour before Oren's departure. She sat down. She did not say anything for a moment, which was her way of indicating that she was about to say something that she had thought about carefully. "The Sulhari Compact is going to file a formal complaint," she said. "Yes," Declan said. "Through the Commercial Authority, which means it routes to the Corridor Council, which means it becomes a matter of record. Yes, your name will be on the incident report. My name was going to be on the incident report regardless," he said. "I filed it." Sulhari looked at the workstation, at the filing references on the secondary screen, the archive timestamps, the registry confirmations. She had been in hub administration long enough to know what those filing categories meant, and to understand that the person who had made them had a more specific understanding of certain procedural frameworks than his job title suggested. She had hired him 3 years ago from a candidate pool that the Hub Directorate's recruitment contractor had described as atypical but meeting all specified criteria. She had read his background file thoroughly. She had made a decision. "The compact will request your personnel file," she said. "It describes a facilities coordination officer." "It does," she said then. "Accurately as far as it goes, he agreed. Sulhari stood. She had the manner of a person who has said what needed to be said and does not feel the need to expand on it. "The individual in Gate 7, she said. "Oren Veth," Declan said. "Connecting departure in 90 minutes. I'll escort him to the gate. The data filings are complete. 3 registries, the Coalition Archive, and the Corridor Council's Open Access Documentation System." He looked at his screen. The information he was carrying is now the kind of information that's already out. Sulhari was quiet for a moment. It was a different quality of quiet than her usual administrative silences. Something with more weight in it. "Good," she said. She left him to his paperwork. Declan walked Oren to gate 7 40 minutes before his departure. The gate was at the far end of the hub's transit wing, past the rows of seating where travelers, in various states of patience and exhaustion, were waiting for their own departures, past the synthesizer kiosks and the currency exchange terminal, and the small meditation alcove that had been installed 3 years ago after a survey found that 7% of transit passengers found the alcove useful, and nobody found it objectionable. Oren had been quiet for most of the walk. He had the specific quality of someone who has been carrying something alone for a long time and is now trying to figure out what his posture is supposed to be when some of the weight has been redistributed. At the gate he stopped. "The town," he said. "In northern Ontario." Declan looked at him. "You said there was a hockey rink." "Since 1987, Declan said. "Do you go back?" Declan considered this. It was the kind of question that had a simple factual answer and a more complicated true answer, and he had learned over years of living with the gap between those two categories that the choice between them was worth taking a moment on. "Not much," he said. "But I know it's there." Oren looked at him. "That's something." "It is," Declan said. The departure announcement came over the hub's audio system. A 3-tone sequence followed by the gate number and the destination in the corridor's 4 primary languages. Oren picked up his bag. He had the same thin, worn quality he'd had in the transit lounge, but something in his posture had shifted in a way that was hard to name precisely. The difference between a person who is running and a person who is walking quickly, maybe. Not safety, not yet. But something adjacent to it. "Thank you," he said. "Safe transit," Declan said. He watched until the gate sealed. Then he turned and walked back through the hub, past the meditation alcove, past the synthesizer kiosks, past the rows of waiting travelers, to his workstation, where the last section of his incident report was still open, and the coffee that the synthesizer had produced was cold, and the running lights of the Calindra corridor's transit lanes moved in their slow patterns outside the observation windows. He finished the report. He filed it through the appropriate channels. Then he sat for a while in the hub's particular silence, the kind that came from being a place where people were always passing through, where the quiet was never really silence, but was instead the accumulated sound of many lives in transit moving toward or away from things that mattered to them, and thought that it was, for the first time in 3 years, a comfortable kind of silence to sit in. The Sulhari Enforcement Compact filed its formal complaint 4 days later. The processing timeline, as Declan had indicated, was 6 to 8 standard cycles. The distributed data filings had been in the Coalition archive for 72 hours before the complaint was submitted. Orrin Veth's connecting departure arrived at its destination on schedule. The documentation he had been carrying was no longer in one place. The people who had wanted it in their control only found it already everywhere else. Seth Varos submitted her own internal report, which described the Verath-7 facilities coordination officer using the Sulhari Compact's formal classification for entities that had not fit their operational models. The classification was marked for follow-up assessment. The follow-up assessment was scheduled for a date that would come and go without producing any additional extractions from Verath-7. Declan's incident report described the events of that Tuesday in the precise, measured language of interagency compliance documentation. It noted the unauthorized arrival, the attempted extraction, the procedural response, the outcome. It listed the relevant articles of the Calindra Corridor Non-Interference Compact. It cross-referenced the appropriate filing indices. It was, as incident reports go, thorough and accurate. It did not mention the coffee, or the observation gallery, or the hockey rink in Northern Ontario that had been in use since 1987. Those were not the kinds of details that belonged in incident reports. They were the kinds of details that belonged to the person who carried them, quiet and present, in the space between what needed to be documented and what simply needed to be true.